The snow came down in Blue Harbor, Maine like it had a personal grudge, each flake sharp and deliberate, piling into drifts that turned the coastal town into a monochrome painting. The sky was a heavy gray, the kind that made the lighthouse on the point look like a stubborn old man refusing to blink. Main Street was hushed, the usual bustle of fishermen and tourists smothered under the storm's weight. At Tide's Edge Cafe, a squat brick building with windows fogged by breath and coffee steam, Sarah Bennett sat alone at a corner table, her wheelchair tucked close to the radiator's hum. It was her 30th birthday, and the single candle on her cupcake flickered, like it wasn't sure it wanted the job. The cupcake chocolate, with a swirl of vanilla frosting, was a gift from Maggie, the cafe's owner, who'd slipped it onto the table with a wink and a "no one turns 30 without cake storm or no storm." Sarah's fingers, steady despite the cold that always seemed to live in her bones, now traced the edge of the plate. She hadn't planned to be here, not like this, not alone with a storm raging outside and a mother who'd called an hour ago to say, "Come home, Sarah. It's not safe out there." Eleanor Bennett's voice had been crisp, the kind of crisp that cut through phone lines and good intentions alike. Sarah had hung up without promising anything, her jaw tight, her heart a quiet drum against the ache of being told where she belonged. The cafe door banged open, letting in a gust of snow, and a man in a worn canvas jacket, his dark hair dusted white. Behind him, a boy in a bright red parka, maybe 7, stomped his boots like he was declaring war on the weather. The man, Ethan Harper, shook snow from his sleeves and scanned the room, his eyes landing on Sarah's table for a half-second before moving on. The boy Levi didn't bother with subtlety. He spotted the cupcake, the candle, the empty chairs, and his face lit up like he'd found a mission. "Dad, look, a birthday?" he said, his voice carrying over the hiss of the espresso machine. Ethan put a hand on Levi's shoulder, a gentle anchor. "Easy, buddy. Let's not bother the lady." But Levi was already moving his boots, squeaking on the hardwood, his eyes fixed on the candle like it was a beacon. Sarah looked up, caught off guard, her hand pausing over the cupcake. The plate wobbled as the wind slammed the door again, rattling the windows. The candle flame dipped. The cupcake slid, and Sarah reached too late. Levi lunged, small hands catching the plate with the precision of a shortstop snagging a line drive. The candle sputtered, but held on. "Got it," Levi said, grinning, his cheeks red from the cold. Ethan was a step behind his jacket, dripping his face, a mix of apology and amusement. "Levi," he said, his voice low but warm, "you don't dive for a stranger's cake without asking." Levi looked at Sarah, his eyes wide with the earnestness only a kid could pull off. "Can I save your birthday, ma'am?" Sarah blinked her breath, catching. She hadn't heard her own voice in hours, not since she'd told Maggie she'd be fine waiting out the storm. Now it came out soft, like it wasn't sure of its welcome. "Yes, please." Levi eased the plate back onto the table, then pressed the candle upright with the care of someone diffusing a bomb. He glanced at Ethan, seeking the nod that came quick and proud. "Nice catch," Ethan said, ruffling Levi's hair. Sarah's hands folded in her lap, her fingers brushing the joystick of her chair. "Thank you," she said, and it came out heavier than she meant, like she was thanking them for more than the save. Ethan tilted his head, his eyes catching hers for a moment longer than necessary. "Storm's got a temper today," he said, glancing at the swaying sign outside the cafe. "You okay here?" Sarah nodded, automatic. "I'm fine." The words were a reflex, polished by years of saying them to doctors, to her mother, to herself in the mirror. The cafe was a small island in the storm, its walls lined with faded photos of Blue Harbor in its fishing heyday boats, heavy with codmen in oilskins grinning into the wind. Maggie, her silver hair pulled into a loose braid, moved behind the counter, with the ease of someone who'd fed this town through decades of nor'easters. She watched Sarah, Ethan, and Levi with a look that said she'd seen every kind of story walk through her door and knew which ones mattered. Levi, undeterred by the silence, climbed onto the chair across from Sarah, his elbows on the table, his chin on his fists. "Do you make a wish?" he asked, staring at the candle like it held secrets. Sarah's lips twitched, almost a smile. "Sometimes," she said. "Sometimes wishes feel too big for a candle." Levi frowned, his brow furrowing like he was working out a math problem. "Then you need a bigger candle," he said, and Sarah laughed a sound that surprised her with its lightness. Ethan hung his jacket on the back of a chair, shaking snow from his hair. He offered a hand, calloused and sure. "Ethan Harper," he said. "This is Levi." Sarah's hand met his, her grip firm, despite the tremor she always fought to hide. "Sarah Bennett." Her voice steadied, like saying her name to them made it hers again. "Do you two make a habit of storm rescues?" Ethan's mouth quirked a half-smile that didn't try too hard. "Only when the snow's this bossy," he said. Levi piped up, "And on days with lightning. Or fog. Or when Dad forgets his hat." Ethan shot him a mock glare. "Traitor." Sarah's eyes flicked between them, the easy rhythm of their banter, like a song she'd forgotten she loved. "Mind if we sit?" Ethan asked, gesturing to the empty chairs. "Storm's not letting anyone out easy today." Sarah waved a hand. "It's your storm as much as mine." The cafe had thinned out the few locals who'd braved the snow, now huddled over mugs, their voices low as if the storm demanded respect. Maggie appeared with 3 mugs of hot cocoa steam curling like a promise. "House rule," she said, setting them down. "Storm cocoa's free if you're by the windows. Hazard pay." Ethan raised a brow. "Generous," Maggie snorted. "Practical. Keeps folks from running into snowbanks and giving me paperwork." Sarah wrapped her hands around the mug, the warmth sinking into her palms like a memory of swimming of water holding her weight, without question. She caught Maggie's eye, and there was a flicker of recognition, not pity, never pity. Maggie had known Sarah's mother Eleanor back when Eleanor was just a local girl with big dreams, not the CEO who now owned half the real estate in Blue Harbor. Maggie knew the weight of a last name like Bennett, and she knew better than to serve it with anything but coffee. So Ethan said, settling into his chair, "What's a person do on a birthday in a blizzard?" Sarah blew on her cocoa, the steam parting like a curtain. "Apparently, she hires a small rescue team." Levi sat up straighter, his chest puffing out. "We work for cookies. Chocolate chip only." Sarah's laugh came easier this time. "Noted." Outside, the snow thickened, piling against the windows like it wanted to join the conversation. The cafe's lights flickered, then steadied, and Maggie muttered something about the generator as she disappeared into the back. Levi leaned closer to Sarah, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "You can tell me your wish. I'm good at keeping secrets." Sarah tilted her head, playing along. "If I tell you, it won't come true." Levi considered this, then nodded sagely. "Okay, but if it's a really good wish, it might sneak out anyway." Ethan chuckled a low rumble that felt like it belonged to the wood he worked with. "He's got a theory about wishes," he said. "Thinks they're like splinters, hard to keep in." Sarah's eyes softened, her fingers brushing the edge of her chair's armrest. "I like that theory," she said. "Splinters find a way." The door banged again, letting in a fisherman in a knit cap, his beard crusted with snow. He stomped his boots and called to Maggie. "You still open? Or is this a snow day?" Maggie's voice floated back. "Open till the roof caves in." The fisherman laughed, ordered a coffee, and settled at the counter. his presence a reminder that Blue Harbor didn't stop for storms, it just slowed down. Sarah watched him, then turned back to Ethan. "You from here?" she asked. Ethan nodded. "Born a mile up the coast. Got a workshop 10 minutes out. We make things, tables, shelves, the occasional rocking chair when Levi's feeling fancy." Levi grinned. "I designed a boat bed once. Dad said it was too wobbly." Ethan's eyes crinkled. It was ambitious. Sarah's gaze drifted to the counter, its edge worn smooth by years of elbows and stories. "Did you make that?" she asked, nodding toward it. Ethan followed her look. "Fixed it last summer. Maggie said the corner was giving up. I convinced it to stay." Sarah's lips curved. "That's a line," she said, and there was a warmth in her voice she hadn't planned. "It's also true," Ethan said, his eyes steady, like he was measuring her the way he measured wood. Levi, still fixated on the candle, asked, "What's the best wish you ever made?" Sarah hesitated, her fingers tightening on the mug. The question wasn't hard, but it landed in a place she hadn't visited in years. Before the accident, before the wheelchair, before her mother's voice became a calendar of commands, she'd wished for things like faster laps, stronger strokes, the feel of water parting under her hands. Now wishes felt like risks. "I wish to swim again," she said finally, her voice quieter than the storm, not sure if it counted. Levi's eyes widened. "You were a swimmer." Sarah nodded, her gaze on the candle's flame. "I was. The kind who counted breaths and chased the wall." Ethan watched her, his expression unreadable but not empty. "Water's patient," he said. "It waits." Sarah's breath caught, and she looked at him, searching for the pity she'd learned to brace for. There was none, just a quiet that felt like listening. The lights flickered again, and a collective murmur ran through the cafe. Maggie reappeared, flipping a breaker with the confidence of a ship captain. "We're still sailing," she called. Levi raised a hand like he was in school. "Can we sing?" he asked, looking at Sarah. Maggie raised a brow. "In my cafe, whales sing if they want to, but keep it soft." Levi grinned, cleared his throat, and launched into a wobbly rendition of Happy Birthday. Ethan joined in his baritone, steadying the melody, and even the fisherman at the counter hummed along. It wasn't perfect, but it was real, and Sarah felt something bloom in her chest, sharp and unfamiliar, like a flower pushing through snow. When they finished, Levi whispered, "Make a backup wish, just in case?" Sarah's eyes stung, but she smiled. "Greedy," she said, and blew out the candle. The thin smoke curled upward, carrying something she wasn't ready to name. Maggie slid a plate of cookies onto the table, chocolate chip, as promised. "On the house," she said. "For surviving my singing," Sarah said, and Maggie laughed, a sound like bells over the harbor. Ethan broke a cookie in half, handing part to Levi. "You keeping that candle?" he asked Sarah. She looked at the wick, black and stubborn. "It's earned its place," she said. "Stubborn candles make the best wishes." Levi nodded like this was gospel. "Wishes need fighters," he said. And Sarah felt the words settle somewhere deep, where old dreams lived. The storm outside didn't care about birthdays or candles. It howled, pressing against the windows. But inside Tide's Edge, the air was warm, the kind of warm that didn't come from radiators alone. Sarah looked at Ethan and Levi, strangers who didn't feel like strangers, and wondered if this was what wishes looked like when they started to sneak out. "You staying till the storm quits?" she asked. Ethan glanced at Levi, then back at her. "We're not in a rush. You." Sarah's fingers brushed the joystick again, a habit of check-in. "I think I'll stay," she said. "The snow's winning, but this table's holding its own." Levi grinned, raising his mug like a toast. To winning tables, Ethan raised his too, his eyes on Sarah. To stubborn candles. Sarah lifted hers, the cocoa still warm against her palms. "To storms that bring people in," she said, and for the first time in years, she meant it. The fisherman at the counter turned his coffee halfway to his mouth. "You folks are making this place sound like a story," he said. Maggie leaned on the counter, her braids swinging. "Every table's a story," she said. "You just have to sit long enough to hear it." Sarah looked at the cupcake, the candle, the two people who'd walked in out of a blizzard, and made her birthday something other than a date to endure. Outside, the snow kept falling, but inside, the room felt like a harbor, small and steady, holding fast against the cold. And Sarah, for the first time in a long time, felt like she might be part of the story, not just the person watching it unfold. The storm had moved out to sea by morning, leaving Blue Harbor under a sky so clear it looked like it had been scrubbed clean. The snow was piled high along Main Street, where plows grumbled through the drifts, and the air smelled of salt and pine, sharp enough to wake a person up. Sarah Bennett sat in her apartment, a small second-floor walk-up, with a view of the harbor's edge, where fishing boats bobbed like they were catching their breath. The wheelchair she'd grown used to over the past 4 years hummed softly as she adjusted it near the window, her hands steady, but her mind restless. The candle from her birthday sat on the kitchen counter, wrapped in a napkin, its wick a quiet reminder of yesterday's warmth at Tide's Edge Cafe. Ethan Harper and his son Levi had stayed longer than the storm, their voices lingering in her head like a melody she hadn't meant to memorize. But now, in the bright light of a new day, her mother's voice cut through the memory. Eleanor Bennett's call came at 8 a.m. sharp as a blade. "Sarah, I need you at the house by noon. We're reviewing the foundation's budget, and your input matters." It wasn't an invitation. It was a summons delivered in the tone Eleanor used to close multi-million-dollar deals. Sarah's fingers tightened on her phone. "I have plans, Mom." There was a pause, the kind that carried weight. "Plans," Eleanor repeated, as if the word was a contract she hadn't signed. "Be practical, Sarah. The roads are clear. I'll send a car." Sarah hung up without agreeing. Her jaw tight, her reflection in the window, looking like a woman who wasn't sure which fight to pick. She wheeled to the counter, picked up the candle, and tucked it into her coat pocket. Practical could wait. She wanted to see where Ethan worked, where Levi's chatter about boat beds and stubborn wood came to life. The address was on a card Maggie had slipped her yesterday, scribbled in pencil, Harper Woodworks, 12 Cove Road. Sarah didn't call ahead. She wasn't sure why, except that calling felt like asking permission, and she was tired of asking. The ride to Cove Road was quiet, the town still shaking off the storm. Her driver, a local named Pete, who'd known her since she was a kid, didn't ask questions. He just helped her down the van's ramp and said, "Holler if you need me." Sarah nodded, her chair's motor purring as she rolled toward the workshop, a low barn-like building with a tin roof and a roll-up door propped open. The smell hit her first cut pine varnish, the clean bite of sawdust. It was the kind of smell that felt like a deep breath you hadn't planned. Inside, Ethan was sanding a cedar plank, his movements slow and deliberate, like he was listening to the wood. Levi sat on a stool, swinging his legs, sketching something on a scrap of paper with a crayon that looked like it had seen better days. He spotted her first, his face breaking into a grin. "Miss Sarah. You came?" He hopped down, nearly tripping over a pile of wood shavings, and ran to her. Ethan looked up, his hands pausing, a faint smile tugging at his mouth. "Didn't expect company?" he said, wiping his hands on a rag. "Storm's gone, but you're welcome anyway." Sarah's lips twitched. "I wanted to see where boat beds get born." Levi beamed, holding up his sketch, a wobbly drawing of a bed shaped like a sailboat, complete with a crayon blue ocean. "This one's for me," he said. "Dad says it's a prototype." Ethan chuckled. "He means it's a dream that needs more nails." Sarah rolled closer, her chair navigating the smooth concrete floor with ease. The workshop was a world of its own tools, hung in neat rows, jars of screws glinting like stars, a half-finished table leaning against the wall, like it was waiting for permission to stand upright. "You built all this?" she asked, her eyes tracing the grain of a cherrywood shelf. Ethan nodded. "Most of it. Some pieces are older than me, passed down from my dad. He taught me to listen to the wood before you cut it." Sarah tilted her head. "That's a line." Ethan's smile widened just enough to show he knew it. "It's also true." They talked the conversation easy, like the tide coming in. Levi showed her his invention corner, a cluttered bench with half-built models of things that might never work, but were loved anyway. Ethan walked her through the shop, pointing out projects: a dining table for a family of 6, a rocking chair for a librarian who liked to read at dawn. Sarah felt something loosen in her chest. A knot she hadn't realized was there. This place wasn't just wood and tools. It was a kind of honest she hadn't touched in years, not since the accident that took her legs and left her counting tiles in a hospital room instead of pool lanes. "What's the best wood?" she asked, her fingers brushing a maple plank. Ethan considered, his eyes on the grain. "Depends. Cherry's honest, tells you what it can handle. Maple's patient, waits for you to get it right. Oak's stubborn, but it softens if you're patient back." Sarah smiled. "Like people." Ethan met her gaze, his eyes steady. "Exactly like people." Across town, in a glass-walled office overlooking the harbor, Eleanor Bennett sat at a desk that cost more than most people's cars. Her hair was pulled back, her suit tailored to a sharpness that matched her voice. She was on the phone with Thomas Reed, her general counsel, a man whose suits always looked like they were apologizing for his conscience. "I want a background check," Eleanor said, her tone clipped. "Discreet. Ethan Harper runs a woodworking shop on Cove Road. My daughter was seen with him yesterday." Thomas hesitated, his pen tapping against a legal pad. "Sarah's 30, Eleanor. She's allowed to have coffee with whoever she wants." Eleanor's eyes narrowed, though he couldn't see it. "She's vulnerable, Thomas. I'm not asking for your opinion. I'm asking for facts." Thomas sighed, a sound that carried years of following orders he didn't like. "I'll look into it. But if there's nothing there, you'll have to let this go." Eleanor didn't respond. She hung up her gaze, drifting to a framed photo on her desk. Sarah at 16, mid-stroke, in a swim, meet her face fierce with focus. That was the Sarah Eleanor remembered, not the one who'd rolled out into a blizzard to sit alone in a cafe. Eleanor's hands clasped together, knuckles white. She wasn't losing her daughter again, not to a storm, not to a stranger, not to anything. Back at the workshop, Sarah watched Levi hammer a nail into a scrap piece, his tongue sticking out in concentration. "You're good at that," she said. Levi grinned. "Dad says I'm an engineer, but I'm still learning gravity." Ethan laughed, leaning against a workbench. "He's got big plans. Wants to build a treehouse that floats." Sarah raised a brow. "Ambitious." Levi nodded solemnly. "Big dreams need big nails." Sarah's laugh was soft, but it felt like stretching a muscle she'd forgotten she had. She looked at Ethan, who was watching her with that same quiet attention, like he was measuring something more than wood. "You always let strangers into your shop?" she asked. He shrugged. "Only the ones who look like they belong." Her breath caught, not because the words were grand, but because they were simple, like a door left open on purpose. Her phone buzzed, shattering the moment. Eleanor's name flashed on the screen, and Sarah's shoulders tensed. She let it go to voicemail, but the silence that followed felt heavier than the storm. Ethan noticed his eyes flicking to the phone, then back to her. "Someone you need to call back," he asked, his tone light, but not careless. Sarah shook her head. "Not yet." Levi, oblivious to the shift, held up his sketch. "Miss Sarah, you should draw something. Dad says everyone's got a picture in their head." Sarah hesitated, then took the crayon he offered. She sketched a simple wave, curling and free, the kind she used to chase in the water. Levi studied it, nodding. "That's a good one. It looks alive." Ethan glanced at the drawing, his expression soft. "It does." By late afternoon, Sarah knew she had to leave. The workshop felt too good, too easy, like a place she could get lost in if she wasn't careful. She thanked Ethan and Levi, promising to come back, and rolled out into the cold, the smell of sawdust clinging to her coat. Pete was waiting his van idling, and he helped her in without a word. As they drove back to her apartment, Sarah's phone buzzed again, a text from Eleanor. "We need to talk about your choices. Dinner, 7 p.m. Sarah didn't reply. She pulled the candle from her pocket, its weight small but sure, and thought about Levi's drawing Ethan's hands the way a room full of wood could feel more like home than her mother's mansion ever had. Meanwhile, Thomas Reed sat in his office, a stack of papers on Ethan Harper in front of him. Bank statements showing a small business scraping by a lease with 6 months left. A list of clients, restaurants, a library, a marina. Nothing alarming, just a man keeping the lights on. Thomas leaned back, rubbing his eyes. He'd met Sarah once years ago when she was still swimming, still smiling, like the world was hers to conquer. He remembered her offering him a peppermint from her bag, her voice bright as she talked about breaking her personal best. Now Eleanor wanted him to dig for dirt on a man who seemed to have nothing but sawdust, and a kid who believed in boat beds. Thomas picked up his phone, dialed a contact at a chain restaurant that had just signed with Ethan for a new bar top. "Hey, it's Reed," he said. "I've got a hypothetical for you. What if there was a whisper about safety issues at Harper Woodworks? Nothing concrete, just chatter." The man on the other end paused, then said, "We'd have to reconsider. Can't risk the optics." Thomas hung up his stomach, turning. He didn't like this, but Eleanor paid for results, not feelings. At the workshop, Ethan was cleaning up sweeping shavings into a pile, while Levi sorted nails into jars. The phone rang, and Ethan answered, his face tightening as he listened. "I understand," he said finally, his voice steady but clipped. "Let me know if you change your mind." He hung up, staring at the receiver like it had betrayed him. Levi looked up. "Bad news." Ethan forced a smile. "Just a client, getting cold feet. We'll find another." But the call was the first crack in a foundation he'd built with his hands, and he felt it sharp and deep. He didn't know about Thomas Reed or Eleanor's orders, or the invisible storm gathering over his shop. All he knew was the weight of a business that carried his son's future, and the memory of Sarah's wave drawn in crayon, curling like it still believed in motion. Sarah, back in her apartment, sat by the window, the harbor glinting under the setting sun. She pulled out her phone, opened a message to Ethan, and typed, "Thanks for today." Her thumb hovered, then deleted it. Instead, she called Maggie. "You ever feel like you're choosing between two worlds?" she asked. Maggie's voice came through warm as the cafe's radiator. "Every day, kid. The trick is knowing which one feels like yours." Sarah hung up her fingers, brushing the candle again. Outside, a gull wheeled over the water, its cry sharp and free. She thought of Ethan's words, Maple's patient, and wondered if she could be patient too, or if the storm her mother was brewing would blow through before she had the chance. The snow had settled into a quiet truce, with Blue Harbor leaving the streets of the small Maine town glazed in white, the harbor reflecting a sky that couldn't decide if it was forgiving or just tired. Sarah Bennett sat in her apartment, the radiator clicking like a metronome, her hands wrapped around a mug of tea that had gone cold. The candle from her birthday, still wrapped in its napkin, sat on the table beside a sketch pad, where she'd drawn a single wave, its curve sharper than she'd meant, like it was fighting the page. Her phone buzzed, Eleanor's name flashing like a warning. Sarah ignored it, her jaw tight. She hadn't spoken to her mother since yesterday's call, when Eleanor's voice had carried that familiar edge of command. "You're not thinking clearly, Sarah. Come home." Home meant the Bennett estate, a sprawling mansion on the cliffs outside town, where every window gleamed with control and every door locked out the world. Sarah's fingers brushed the joystick of her wheelchair, a reflex, a grounding. She wasn't going back, not today, not to a place that felt more like a museum than a home. Instead, she thought of Harper Woodworks, of Ethan's hands moving over cedar, of Levi's earnest voice saying, "Big dreams need big nails." She wanted to go back to feel that warmth again, but something held her, a fear that the workshop's light wouldn't hold up against her mother's shadow. Across town at Harper Woodworks, Ethan Harper swept sawdust into neat piles, the broom's rhythm steady, but his mind uneven. The call from the chain restaurant yesterday still stung, a contract for a bar top, gone with a vague excuse about concerns. He'd sent emails, attached safety certifications, photos of his work, but the replies were polite and final. Levi sat cross-legged on the floor, sorting screws into jars, his small hands precise. "Dad, why do people change their minds?" he asked, not looking up. Ethan paused, leaning on the broom. "Sometimes they hear a rumor and don't wait for the truth," he said. Levi frowned, a screw held up to the light like evidence. "That's not fair." Ethan's mouth twitched, not quite a smile. "Fair's a tough customer, kid." He didn't tell Levi about the second call that morning, a smaller client, a marina, needing a new counter, pushing their order to spring. The workshop felt quieter today, the hum of tools not enough to drown out the questions piling up like the snow outside. At the Bennett estate, Eleanor stood in her office, the harbor, a silver ribbon below. Her desk was a fortress of glass and steel. A single photo of Sarah at a swim meet, the only soft thing in the room. Thomas Reed sat across from her, his suit as crisp as his voice was careful. "I made the calls," he said, setting a folder on the desk. "Harper's lost the restaurant contract. The marina's on hold. There's chatter now, nothing concrete, just enough to make clients nervous." Eleanor's eyes didn't leave the harbor. "Good," she said. "He's a risk, Thomas. Sarah's vulnerable." Thomas shifted his pen, tapping once, twice. "He's a widower with a kid, Eleanor. His shop's clean. No violations. No beat he can't manage. The only risk is he's not you." Eleanor's gaze snapped to him, sharp as a blade. "You're paid to protect my family, not to lecture." Thomas met her eyes unflinching. "I'm protecting Sarah by telling you the truth. You're not saving her. You're isolating her." Eleanor's hand tightened on the desk's edge, but she said nothing. Thomas stood, leaving the folder behind. "I'll keep digging, but I won't lie. There's nothing to find." The door closed softly, but it felt like a crack in her armor. Sarah didn't know about the calls or the folder. She only knew the weight of her mother's voice, the way it pressed against her, choices like a storm against a window. She wheeled to her sketch pad, added a line to the wave, a small boat bobbing stubborn. Her phone buzzed again, a text from Maggie at tide's edge. "You okay, kid? Harbor's calm, but you're not." Sarah smiled, her fingers hovering over the reply. "Trying to be." She typed, then deleted it. Instead, she grabbed her coat, tucked the candle into her pocket, and called Pete for a ride. Not to the workshop, her courage wasn't there yet, but to the pier where the lighthouse stood watch. The air was cold, the snow crunching under her wheels as she rolled to the edge, the water below a mirror of the sky. She thought of Ethan's words. Maple's patient. It waits. She wanted to wait to believe in that patience, but the tide in her chest was restless, pulling her toward something she couldn't name. At the workshop, Ethan was planning a maple plank when the phone rang again. Another client, a library this time reassessing priorities. He hung up his hands steady, but his eyes dark. Levi looked up, sensing the shift. Another one, Ethan nodded, setting the plane down. We'll be okay, Levi. We always are. But the words felt thin like wood, sanded too far. He didn't know Eleanor's hand was behind the cancellations, but he felt the pressure the way a carpenter feels a knot in the grain before it splits. Levi stood brushing sawdust from his jeans. Can we go see Miss Sarah, Ethan? Hesitated, his hand on the workbench. She's got her own storm, buddy. We don't push in uninvited. Levi's brow furrowed, his small face fierce. But she smiled real with us. That means something. Ethan looked at him, saw the stubborn hope in his son's eyes, and felt his own resolve waver. Okay, he said finally. We'll go, but we're just standing, not pushing. Levi grinned, grabbing his red parka. Standing's enough. The Bennett estate loomed at the edge of Blue Harbor, its iron gates tall and unyielding, the mansion beyond a monument to Eleanor's success. Ethan parked his truck 100 yards out, the engine ticking as it cooled. Levi hopped out, his boots crunching on the gravel, and ran to the gate, pressing his face between the bars. Miss Sarah, he called, his voice clear and sharp, cutting through the winter air. Ethan followed slower, his hands in his pockets, his breath visible. Levi, easy, he said, but there was no stopping the boy. Miss Sarah, it's us, Levi called again, his hands gripping the bars like he could will them open. Ethan stood behind him, scanning the windows for movement, his heart a quiet drum. He didn't know what he expected Sarah to appear or Eleanor to send someone to chase them off. Either way, he was here, standing as promised. Inside the mansion, Sarah was in her room sketching another wave, this one with a lighthouse in the distance. Levi's voice reached her through the open window, raw and unmistakable. She froze her pencil, hovering her chest tight. Anna, the housekeeper who'd been with the family since Sarah was a girl, appeared in the doorway. There's a boy at the gate, she said softly, her eyes kind but cautious. And his father. They're calling for you. Sarah's hands tightened on the sketch pad. Mom won't like it, she said, her voice low. Anna stepped closer, her apron smelling faintly of lemon and flour. Your mother's in her office planning a world that doesn't need her permission to turn. You decide who you answer to. Sarah looked at her, then at the window where Levi's voice came again, fainter but stubborn. I can't, she whispered, then stopped, hating the sound of her own fear. Anna didn't push. She just nodded, her hand brushing Sarah's shoulder. I'll tell them you heard, she said, and left. Outside, Anna stepped through the service gate, her boots sinking into the snow. She studied Ethan and Levi, her face unreadable, but not unkind. She's not coming down, she said, her voice steady. Not because she doesn't want to, but because she's not ready. Levi's hands tightened on the bars, his eyes bright with disappointment. Can you tell her we miss her? He asked. Anna's expression softened just a fraction. I will. Ethan nodded, his voice calm but heavy. Thank you. That's all we needed. Levi looked up at him, then back at Anna. Tell her I'm keeping her wave, he said, patting his pocket where he'd tucked the sketch Sarah had drawn. Anna's lips curved a small smile that felt like a promise. "I'll tell her that too." As they walked back to the truck, Levi's shoulders slumped, but he didn't cry. Ethan rested a hand on his son's head, the weight of it grounding them both. "We did what we could," he said. Levi nodded, his voice small. "She heard us." "Right." Ethan looked back at the gate, its iron bars gleaming in the fading light. "Yeah, buddy. She heard us." Inside, Sarah wheeled to the window, her hands trembling as she watched the truck's taillights disappear. She pulled the candle from her pocket, its wick a silent witness. Anna returned, slipping a small folded paper into Sarah's hand. A note Levi had pressed into her palm, a crayon drawing of a boat on a wave with 3 stick figures labeled, "Me, Dad, Sarah." Sarah's throat tightened and she looked at Anna. "I should have gone down," she said. Anna shook her head. "You'll go when you're ready. They'll wait." Back at the workshop, Ethan sat at his bench, staring at a maple plank that was supposed to be a bar top, but now might never leave the shop. The phone was silent, the air heavy with the kind of quiet that follows bad news. Levi sat nearby, coloring with fierce concentration, his crayon pressing hard enough to dent the paper. "We're not giving up, right?" he asked, his voice a mix of hope and defiance. Ethan looked at him, saw the boy who'd shouted at an iron gate, and felt something steady take root. "No, we're not," he said. "We build what we can, and we stand for the rest." Levi nodded, returning to his drawing, adding a lighthouse to the wave, its beam cutting through the dark. At the estate, Eleanor stood in her office, the folder on Ethan Harper open on her desk. Thomas had added a new page, testimonials from clients who'd worked with Ethan, all glowing, all irrelevant to her. She closed the folder, her hands steady, but her mind not. Sarah's silence was louder than any argument they'd ever had, and for the first time Eleanor wondered if control was a currency she'd spent too freely. She picked up her phone, typed a message to Sarah. "I'm trying to understand," then deleted it. Instead, she called Thomas. "Stop the calls," she said, her voice tight. "No more pressure on Harper." Thomas paused, then said, "Good choice, Eleanor." She hung up, staring at the photo of Sarah the swimmer, and wondered if she'd ever known the woman her daughter had become. Sarah, still by her window, unfolded Levi's drawing again. The stick figures stood together, unshaken by the wave. She traced the lighthouse with her finger, its beam a small, stubborn light. Her phone buzzed, another text from Maggie. "You're stronger than any storm, kid. Come by tomorrow." Sarah smiled, her chest loosening. She typed a reply. "I'll be there." Then she wheeled to her sketchpad, added a figure to her wave. A woman, not swimming, but sailing her boat, small but steady. Outside, the harbor glittered, the lighthouse watching, and Sarah felt the first stirrings of a choice she wasn't afraid to make. The morning broke over Blue Harbor, with a sky so clear it seemed to hum, the kind of pale gold that only comes after a storm has spent its anger and left the world washed new. The harbor sparkled, its waves catching the light like a promise kept, and the lighthouse on the point stood sentinel, its beam off, but its presence steady. At the edge of Harper Woodworks, a small larch ran fast and bright, its banks still swollen from the snowmelt. Ethan Harper was already there, sorting through planks of reclaimed oak, his hands moving with the quiet certainty of a man who knew bridges weren't built on haste. Sarah Bennett rolled her wheelchair across the damp grass, the motor's hum blending with the creek's chatter. She wore a simple ivory sweater, its sleeves rolled up, her hair loose and catching the breeze. In her lap was Levi's crayon drawing the boat and lighthouse, now creased from being carried, and beside it, the birthday candle unwrapped, but unlit, a small talisman of the day that started it all. Today was her wedding day, not to a grand hall or a crowd, but to Ethan, to Levi, to a life she'd chosen, plank by plank. The creek's bank was their ceremony ground. The bridge they'd built together, their altar, and the guest list was small by design. Levy Eleanor, Maggie Thomas Reed, and Anna, the housekeeper who'd become more family than employee. Ethan looked up as Sarah approached his navy flannel, traded for a crisp jacket, his hands clean of sawdust for once. "You're early," he said, his smile soft but wide, like he'd been waiting for this moment longer than the morning. Sarah tilted her head, her eyes bright. "Couldn't let you build this day without me." Levi ran over his small suit, slightly askew, a paper crane tucked into his pocket. "Miss Sarah, you're gonna love the bridge today," Dad said. "It's ready for walking." Sarah laughed, the sound light and sure, a far cry from the hesitant voice she'd used in the cafe a month ago. "I think it's been ready for a while, Levi." She glanced at the bridge, its oak planks sturdy, the railing smooth, from hours of sanding. It wasn't perfect. There were knots in the wood, a slight dip where the creek curved, but it held, and that was enough. Eleanor Bennett arrived next. Her wool coat too formal for the creek's muddy banks. Her face a mix of resolve and something softer, something she hadn't worn in years. She stepped carefully, her heels sinking slightly, and stopped beside Sarah. "You look like yourself," she said, her voice low, almost fragile. Sarah met her mother's eyes, searching for the control that had always lived there. It was gone, or at least quieter, replaced by a hesitation that felt like a hand reaching out. "I feel like myself," Sarah said, and the words were a bridge of their own, small but spanning years of silence. Maggie followed, carrying a basket of wildflowers, daisies, and sea lavender tied with twine. "No soup today," she called, setting the basket on a makeshift table of stacked crates. "But I've got muffins, and they're just as binding." Thomas Reed, in a blazer that looked like it was trying not to notice the mud, chuckled as he helped Maggie arrange the flowers. Anna brought up the rear, her apron swapped for a dress, her eyes crinkling as she caught Sarah's gaze. "You're glowing, Mija," she said, and Sarah's throat tightened, not with tears, but with the weight of being seen. They gathered at the bridge's foot, the creek murmuring below, the harbor's gulls calling in the distance. Thomas cleared his throat, stepping forward as the unofficial officiant, his glasses catching the light. "Before we start," he said, "I think it's only right we say something about what brought us here. Not just the creek, not just the wood, but the choices." He looked at Sarah and Ethan, his voice steady. "You two built something stronger than oak. You built trust." Levi tugged at Thomas's sleeve, whispering loudly, "Can I say something too?" Thomas grinned, stepping aside. "The floor's yours, young man." Levi stood tall, his paper crane peeking from his pocket. "When you build a bridge," he said, his voice serious as a sermon, "you gotta start on both sides. If you only start on one, it falls. You and Dad started on both." "Miss Sarah." Sarah's laugh was soft, her eyes glistening. "You're our best engineer, Levi," she said, and Ethan crouched to meet his son's gaze, his hand on Levi's shoulder. "Couldn't have done it without you." Eleanor stepped forward. Her hands clasped her posture, less like a CEO and more like a woman standing on unfamiliar ground. "Sarah," she said, and the name carried a weight it hadn't before. "I thought my job was to keep you safe by keeping you close. I was wrong. My job was to let you choose your own crossing." She glanced at Ethan, then Levi, her eyes lingering on the boy's open face. "You've chosen well." Ethan nodded a quiet acknowledgement, not of her approval, but of her effort. "Thank you," he said simply, and the words were enough to hold the moment steady. The vows came next, plain and true, like the wood they stood on. Ethan went first, his voice low but clear, carrying over the creek's song. "Sarah, I used to think love was a moment big loud, like a wave crashing. But you showed me it's the quiet work, the sanding, the waiting, the standing through storms. I choose you every day, every plank. Sarah's breath caught her hand steady on the wheels of her chair. Ethan, she said, you taught me that strength isn't swimming alone against the tide. It's knowing someone's on the other bank, building with you. I choose you in the sun, in the snow, in every current between. Levi whooped, breaking the solemnity, and Maggie laughed, tossing a daisy into the air. Thomas raised a hand, his voice warm. By the power of this creek, this town, and these good people, I pronounce you married. There was no applause, just a collective breath, a shared quiet, that felt like the moment after a perfect cut. When the wood falls clean, Sarah and Ethan moved to the bridge's center, her chair rolling smoothly, his hand resting lightly on hers. Halfway across, Sarah stopped, looking out at the creek, its water catching the gold of the sky. This is what choosing feels like, she said, her voice soft but sure. Ethan squeezed her hand. And this is what staying looks like. Behind them, Levi ran to the railing, peering at the water. It's like our boat drawing, he said, pointing to the ripples. Eleanor joined him, her heels forgotten, her face softening, as she listened to his chatter about waves and lighthouses. Maggie and Anna set out muffins and coffee, the table a small harbor of its own, while Thomas snapped a photo, his smile genuine for the first time in years. The bridge wasn't just wood and nails. It was a testament to what they'd built together, not just Sarah and Ethan, but all of them. Eleanor, who'd learned to let go of control one plank at a time. Levi, whose stubborn hope had called Sarah to the gate. Maggie, whose cafe had held them through the storm. Anna, who'd opened doors when others closed them. Thomas, who'd chosen conscience over contract. Sarah looked at them gathered on the bank and felt a quiet settle in her chest, not the absence of noise, but the presence of something whole. We built this, she said, her voice carrying to the group, not just the bridge, but the space between us. It's proof that people can change, that love can be chosen, that we can meet in the middle. Eleanor, standing beside Levi, ran a hand along the railing, her fingers tracing the grain. I spent years thinking strength was keeping the world out, she said. Now I see it's letting the right people in. Levi looked up at her, his eyes bright. You're like oak, Miss Eleanor, stubborn but soft, if you listen. Eleanor's laugh was small, surprised the sound of a woman rediscovering her own voice. I'll take that, she said, and Levi grinned, handing her a daisy. Maggie called from the table, Enough poetry, folks. Eat before the gulls get ideas. The group laughed, the sound mingling with the creek's current, a harmony that didn't need to be perfect to be true. As they ate, Sarah wheeled to the bridge's far side, Ethan beside her, his hand warm against the morning's chill. You know, she said, when I was swimming, I thought the water was the only thing that held me. Now I see it was just practice for this, for building something that holds us all. Ethan's eyes crinkled, his smile a quiet promise. You're the best plank I ever chose, he said, and Sarah laughed, the sound carrying across the water. Levi ran up, holding a muffin like a trophy. Can we build another bridge, he asked. Sarah looked at Ethan, then at the group, Eleanor sharing a story with Anna Maggie, teasing Thomas about his muddy boots. We're already building it, she said. Every day. The harbor bells rang noon, their chime rolling over the water, clear and bright. The group lingered, no one eager to break the spell. Sarah looked out at the horizon where the sea met the sky and thought of the wave she'd drawn the boat that hadn't sunk. This bridge, she said, her voice steady, meant for the creek, the people, the day. It's not just about crossing. It's about standing together, forgiving what broke and choosing what stays. If you take anything from today, let it be this: build your own bridges. Not with wood or nails, but with courage, with forgiveness, with the kind of love that doesn't demand, but gives. Find the people who meet you in the middle and hold fast. That's the work that lasts. Ethan squeezed her hand, his eyes wet but steady. "You're preaching now," he said, his voice warm. Sarah smiled, her heart full. "Maybe, but it's a good sermon." Levi tugged at her sleeve, holding up his paper crane. "For you," he said. "So you don't forget the bridge." Sarah took it, her fingers gentle, and tucked it beside the candle in her pocket. "I won't," she said. The group moved back to the table, the muffins dwindling, the coffee cooling, but the warmth between them growing. Eleanor sat beside Sarah, not speaking, just present, her hand close enough to touch, but not reaching a gesture of trust. Maggie raised her mug, a toast to no one and everyone. "To bridges," she said. Thomas lifted his voice quiet but clear. "To choices." Anna added, "To family." Levi, his mouth full of muffin, mumbled, "To boats." And they laughed, the sound a tide that carried them forward. As the sun climbed higher, the creek kept singing its song, older than any of them, but new with their laughter. The bridge stood firm, its planks bearing the weight of their steps, their stories, their choices. Sarah looked at Ethan, at Levi, at the family they'd built not by blood but by heart, and knew this was the crossing she'd been swimming toward all along. The lighthouse watched its shadow, long and steady, a reminder that some things, love, forgiveness, the courage to begin again, are stronger than any storm. And as they walked back toward the workshop, the harbor glinting behind them, Sarah felt the world shift, not with a crash, but with the quiet certainty of a bridge well built, ready to carry them all home.